Hello and thank you. Fundamentally, I'm an education scientist, so I'm really here to make the case for why education matters in the development of the experts that we want for healthcare today. And I'm very lucky to be going after Jeff because my talk does build on his in significant ways. So when we think about healthcare today, I don't think anybody here would argue, and certainly not what I've heard so far this morning and this afternoon, that there are many new systems, there's new technologies, new patients, a lot of new knowledge. It's a very complex, challenging place to work. And we need to make sure that the people that we're developing and training in order to go out into that workplace are prepared to do so very well. So when you think about a routine work situation, something you've seen before and know how to deal with, those are easy examples for us all, right? So that resonates with people. We know the things that we know how to do. We know things we've seen before. And as Jeff said, when things are proceeding normally, experts really do what normally works. They have a lot of experience and they're able to draw on that experience very effectively and efficiently to solve those routine problems that they should know how to solve. And what about a non-routine work situation? So something you've never seen before or don't know how to deal with. I think we can all probably think of those as well in whatever domain we work in. So those situations require something a little bit different. So the framework of adaptive expertise tells us that experts are able to both use existing knowledge to solve known problems, so that efficiency that I just talked about, the accumulation of experiences and knowledge that you're able to use effectively. But they're also able to adapt and create knowledge to solve new problems, things they haven't seen before, uncertainty, novelty, complexity, all those things that arguably are becoming more prevalent in today's healthcare workplace. And importantly, they're able to learn through these types of problem solving that they're engaged in. So it's not a sporadic moment of problem solving that you then forget and move on, but rather it feeds into that evolving knowledge base and experience base that is building your expertise as you go through your practice. So what I'm really describing is two dimensions of expertise. One is efficiency, so the ability to use and apply your knowledge effectively and efficiently to solve problems that you should know how to solve. And the other is innovation. So in moments of uncertainty, complexity, novelty, what do? Most experts don't freeze. They tend to solve the problem. They tend to work through it and figure it out. And what's critical about these two dimensions of expertise, if we think about it, is that you have to have an optimal balance between them. So you can't have people who are always trying to fit a known solution to a problem that they see if it's inappropriate to do so, right? So that's over-efficient. But you also can't have people who are constantly trying to reinvent the wheel and, every single time develop a new solution to whatever problem it is they're trying to solve. So you need that optimal adaptability between efficiency and innovation. And a key capability that's been articulated in the literature that supports that balance between efficiency and innovation is preparation for future learning. So that's really defined as the ability to learn new information, make effective use of resources, and invent new procedures in order to support learning and problem solving in practice. And it's been articulated as a key capability of expertise. So what is it that adaptive experts do then? Well, they build domain knowledge through experience, and then we just learned a little bit about that. They move from procedural to conceptual knowledge, so they know what to do, but they also know why they're doing it. So they're building that conceptual knowledge as they work. And so really what adaptive experts are able to do is not just use and apply their knowledge or replicate it, but also use knowledge to build new knowledge. So for them, their knowledge is a starting point often. It's something they can use to jump off and create new solutions where necessary for their patients in medicine. So when you're using knowledge to build new knowledge, what might that look like? And Barreder and Scardamelli have put forward this idea of progressive problem solving. So that's this notion that you reduce the number of problems that you're experiencing, and through expertise we do that, right? So things that are problems for novices are not really problems for experts. So we're able to reduce those problems, but we can, if we want to, reformulate them at a higher level. So include other dimensions of complexity, other aspects of the problem, and constantly reformulate those problems and reinvest ourselves cognitively in understanding those problems at those increasing levels of complexity. We can also do that by problematizing established routines. So sometimes there are moments when something does work, but maybe we could do this a little bit better. So there are a lot of ways to purposefully reinvest yourself back into your practice as a way of progressive problem solving. So what does that look like? What can it look like? We did a study in 2012, including Jeff Norman, And this was really looking at renowned physicians of their own expert diagnostic practice. So these were physicians who were nominated across 6 North American institutions as local legends, the people that you go to when you cannot figure it out. These are general internists. And what they mentioned is that, or what they described, is that it's critical to possess and maintain an extensive knowledge base. I don't think that's surprising to anybody or really arguable. We know this about expertise. We know experts know a lot about the domain that they work in. And they talked about actually doing this through continual engagement in their practice, so seeing patients and seeing a lot of patients. So that volume did matter, that experience did matter. But they also talked about carefully gathering comprehensive patient stories, so really engaging with patients, understanding the narrative of the patient, and the knowledge that the patient is bringing to the situation in the form of their own personal stories. Maybe it's their expectations, what they need and want, and how they're experiencing their interaction with the healthcare system. And they talked about integrating their knowledge, their expert knowledge, with these patient stories in a way that was able to meet the needs of that patient, or diagnose the patient most importantly, but also come up with a treatment plan that would meet the needs of that patient. And then they talked about learning as a purposeful lifelong activity. So they really talked about these interactions with patients, every single one being something that was a learning experience for them. So this idea that problem solving was not application of knowledge in a straightforward way, but rather was an opportunity for them to continually learn and reinvest themselves back into their practice. Unexpected things were learning opportunities for them. So when we think about expertise, and actually when we think about practice, people who practice in the world, we know that people have many pockets of routine expertise where they're highly efficient without deep understanding of why, right? So you can be really good at something and not really understand why, and we all have those pockets of routinization in our practice, and that's not necessarily a bad thing until it is. So people, in solving a large number of problems, can merely learn to perform a skill faster and more accurately without developing their conceptual knowledge. And that can happen very easily for people as they go through their practice and their work. So it leads us to think about the idea, and it lines up with what the renowned physicians told us, that expertise is really something that you do. It's not something that you are. It's not something you have. It's not a credential you've earned. It's something you continually reinvest in your daily work. So it leads to the idea that expert-novice differences aren't really the only things that we should be attending to. So it's also the idea that somebody can be an experienced non-expert, that you can have many, many years of experience and not have developed the expertise that we might need you to develop in order to have that balance of innovation and efficiency in your practice, to be able to solve a problem you haven't seen before, to handle that uncertainty, to deal with the complexity. So eventually they'll quit being novices without our having to do anything about it. The important question is, what will they become? Will they become experts in their lines of work, or will they swell the ranks of the incompetent or mediocre? So from an education perspective, what we're really highlighting here is that there's not one spontaneous course of expertise, and we have to be very careful about which path we're setting our students on. Do we want them to be routine experts who have that efficiency dimension of their work established? And that's great, it's critical, it's important, you need that. But we also want people who have that innovation dimension of their work well developed, so they can be optimally adaptive when they need to be. And arguably, the imperative for that in today's healthcare workplace is becoming more and more urgent. So now I'm at the education part. I would argue, and I think many of my colleagues would, that education has to be optimized to develop these experts that we need, and we have to think carefully and systematically about what education and training opportunities we're giving our students in order to develop along those trajectories of expertise. So I'm going to talk about 3 broad principles of education that feed into the development of adaptive expertise. So the first is, broadly, education approaches which emphasize understanding. And one very powerful example of that is the idea of integrated instruction, which has been developed quite extensively by my colleagues at the Wilson Center, most notably Nikki Woods and Mahan Kulasegram. So integrated instruction refers to the idea that integration of basic and clinical science creates deeper understanding and conceptual coherence. I think somebody earlier mentioned the term explanatory coherence, which can work here as well. So what does that mean? Here's some clinical instruction. So brainstem strokes cause diplopia. Here's integrated instruction. Nerves which control the eyeball muscles arise in the brainstem, and loss of their function leads to double vision or diplopia. This is proximate instruction. Nerves which control the eyeball muscles arise in the brainstem. Brainstem strokes cause diplopia. That can be later on somewhere in a narrative. This is also proximate instruction. So just putting scientific facts next, or clinical signs and symptoms next to each other, isn't really sufficient to get the level of integration and conceptual coherence that we're looking for. You have to attend very carefully and deliberately to construct that integration for our students. It doesn't occur spontaneously when students learn things at the same time. And I think that's a really key point that we talk about a lot when we're talking to educators. So we know, based on a lot of the work that Nikki has done, that integration of basic science leads to better retention of learning over time. It leads to improved diagnostic accuracy. It leads to better performance on complex cases. But does integrated instruction better prepare students for future learning? So remember I talked about the importance of preparation for future learning as a capability of adaptive expertise. Well, how does it work with integrated instruction? So we did a study, well actually this is from a previous study. So this is the model of how you can test for whether or not something is helping students learn from later instruction. So you have instruction A or instruction B. The students do an initial assessment. Both groups get a common learning experience, and then you do a final assessment that assesses how well they were able to learn from that common learning experience. In our case, the two conditions were basic science instruction and clinically focused instruction, and I've given you an example of what integrated basic science instruction might look like. So we had a basic science integrated group and a clinical science only group. They did an initial assessment of how well they learned. It was 4 neurological conditions. And then they had a common learning experience, which is clinical science. And then we assessed how well they were able to learn from that common learning experience. And what we found is that the group that receives, well, there's no difference on initial assessment. So after the groups receive either basic science integrated instruction or clinical science instruction, there's absolutely no difference in how well they learned those first 2 rounds or how well they perform on tests of learning for those 2 forms of instruction. But then on the assessment of how well they learned, each group learned on the common learning resource, the group that received the initial integrated basic science instruction performed significantly better. So what that really tells us, and we're continuing to work on this, is that integrated instruction appeared to better prepare students for future learning. So students who had received that initial integrated instruction were able to learn the second set of new materials better than the first group, or better than the other group, I should say. It's really important to note that integration is a cognitive activity that happens within the learner. So we're really talking about that conceptual coherence. So basic instruction, essentially, we're arguing, can help hold together a mental network of clinical concepts, and that's why it's important for our trainees to have access to that. So it's really cognitive integration at that cognitive level that appears to be supporting the capabilities of adaptive expertise, and specifically preparation for future learning. What we're doing now is considering the forms of knowledge of integration that might matter for adaptive expertise. So far when we think about basic science, we've talked a lot about pathophysiology, biomedical knowledge, anatomy, but Catherine Lucy, in an interesting article in 2013, asked us what enduring social systems, biomedical, and behavioral constructs must be mastered by students to help them understand the human condition, participate in the continuous improvement of healthcare, and prepare for lifelong learning. So what if we extended ourselves to think about what basic science might be? And if we start to think about mechanistic knowledge that explains why, I think we can move beyond pathophysiology and biomedical knowledge. We can move to social determinants, we can move to systems understanding, the patient's own history. There are lots of different ways to understand the why and the mechanism of why a patient might be presenting in a certain way at a certain time. So I want to draw your attention to one last aspect of that study, and it's that there was no difference on the initial assessment, and there was a significant difference on the final assessment. And what that really tells us is that some forms of instruction that we might be using in our education might, on immediate assessment, not matter. So we think to ourselves, well, what's the point? You know, the students are doing just as well no matter what we do, so why are we bothering with integrated instruction? It's a lot more work for our tutors, it's a lot more work for our faculty to train them. But really what we're looking for is that we're better positioning students to learn from their future experiences. And when you think about adaptive expertise, that's really the core capability that we're talking about. So the next education approach that I want to talk about is education approaches that highlight variability. And the main thing I'm going to focus on is contextual variation. So contextual variability allows learners to develop differentiated knowledge about phenomena and an understanding of the significance of those differences. And this is key, right? Meaningful variation, not just variation for the sake of variation, but how do you draw students' attention to why those variations might matter? So I'm going to ask you to describe this figure. I could just do it for you. So what are some things? right? Letters in red, good, right? Those are some of the things that we can see initially when we see something, whatever it is. Now, what about now? How would you describe when I put something else next to it? Do you see anything else about that figure? Yeah. So some other features that we didn't pop out at us are suddenly becoming more salient because we're seeing it in the context of something else. What about now? We're still describing the figure in red, remember? Alphabetic. Yeah, so now it's alphabetic as well. So it's just a figure, I know, but it's a nice demonstration of how seeing something in the context of something else can help make salient important differences. And a good teacher will help students make sense of those differences. So then you go back to describing the figure. And the key here is that what you're not really trying to take every single example that you see and memorize it, but rather you're trying to abstract and understand a little bit about those key things that are important for this figure so that the next time you see this figure, you're going to note that it's alphabetic, that the grid lines are all equivalent, that it's red, whatever else you can note. And that's going to be based on how you were taught or what you were taught to attend to in the variation. So really, it's the idea that a single stimulus can be defined in the context of a field of alternatives, and that the field becomes something that you know with, that it affects what you notice about subsequent events. So a really nice example of this was done in 1998 by Dan Schwartz and John Bransford. And they asked if analysis of contrasting cases better prepares students for future learning from an expert. So now we're going back to looking at preparation for future learning specifically. And there are 3 groups. So one group, this is students doing statistics instruction, but I'm not going to get into the details of the statistics instruction right now. So this is 3 groups. The first group was asked to actually find a pattern of contrasting cases, find a pattern among a number of cases that they were provided with. So they were asked to sort of work through it and figure it out. And then they received some direct instruction from an expert on some of the main principles that were embedded in those cases that they had to sort of learn and understand in order to understand those patterns. The second group just read and summarized a chapter on exactly the same principles and then also received the lecture. And the third group did 2 sets of contrasting cases. So they had to do find patterns for one set of things and then find patterns for another set of things. And again, this is a detailed study, but these are the main things you have to know. And what they found was that analyzing the cases prepared the students to learn. So on subsequent tests, what you found was that the students that did the analysis of the contrasting cases followed by a direct instruction, they were better able to learn from that expert lecture that they were provided with on the subsequent test. And essentially what Dan Schwartz and John Bransford argued was that what the initial struggle, that initial sort of trying to play with those contrasting cases did was create a time for telling. So after the students had struggled and tried to figure out those cases and done the variation in the contrasting cases, then they were ready to hear what that expert had to say in a meaningful way and learn from it. And the opportunity for further learning was needed. So the students that had the contrasting cases followed by contrasting cases did not see the advantage of that condition, of the contrasting case activity. So you had to receive the expert lecture in order to see any advantage of doing that contextual variation. So again, it points to the idea that what we're really looking for is better positioning students to learn from future experiences. What that also means is that we have to give them those future experiences. So you have to give that lecture after. You can't just have students struggle and look at variation and go through things that by themselves and expect them to learn. You want to then also add in that lecture afterwards. And that makes it a very powerful learning experience for them. And the final thing I'm going to talk about is education approaches which emphasize struggle and risk-taking. And really the one I just described is also an example of that. But how many of you, I think most people have heard the term active learning. So activities that promote synthesis, analysis, differentiation, and generation of knowledge. This can be many different things. It's not just one thing, but I'm really going to talk about this idea of productive failure, or really guided discovery and struggle. So this is a study done by Manu Kapoor in 2014. And he did something very similar to the previous study that I talked about. So one group got discovery learning followed by direct instruction, and this was math. And then the second group did direct instruction first by a teacher, and then they had the opportunity to also go through those discovery learning problems. And what Kapoor found was that the productive failure students, and he called them that because they completely miserably failed on that initial attempt to solve those problems themselves, significantly outperformed the direct instruction students on conceptual understanding and transfer. So they had learned much better. They'd learned the conceptual understanding much better. And importantly, in the transfer test, the students had to learn a new concept during that test. So it wasn't an application test. It was rather you have to learn something new and now demonstrate your knowledge of that something new by doing well on this test. Again, we're pointing to the idea that they were better positioned to learn from those future experiences. And importantly, when I said that they did better they were outperformed on conceptual understanding and transfer, they didn't compromise their procedural knowledge. So a lot of people often ask me whenever I go talk about this that essentially that says 20 minutes. Do you mean? Okay, thank you. Like, okay, that confused me. Interruptions, Jeff. See, that did throw me off, just so you're aware. Yeah. So it didn't compromise procedural knowledge. So what people often ask me is, yeah, okay, that's all nice. They're getting the conceptual knowledge. They're doing well in the transfer test. They're showing PFL. But they need to learn fundamentals first. And they need to learn that procedural knowledge, and they can't do anything until they've done that. But what this study and a lot of others like it show is that you can aim at PFL and you can aim at conceptual knowledge without compromising procedural knowledge at all. But if you do the other way around, so the direct instruction group, sure, they do great on the procedural knowledge, but they don't do as well on conceptual knowledge and they don't do as well on the transfer test. So if you're considering what kind of education you want to aim at, I would argue that you want to be aiming for the conceptual knowledge and the preparation for future learning, and you'll get the procedural knowledge along with that. So overall, what I want to leave you with is the idea that to educate and to train for adaptive experts, you need to focus on educational approaches that emphasize understanding, and I've given you an example of one, so that's integrated instruction, but I think there are many more ways to do that in your own context. Educational approaches that focus on meaningful variation, and the meaningful bit here is key. Variation for the sake of variation isn't going to get you very far. And productive struggle. So you can't let students struggle and fail without following it up with guided instruction and direct instruction, but that struggle can be very productive if you do those things together. So again, Lucy stated that realizing the promise of high-quality healthcare will require that medical educators accept that they must fulfill their contract with society to reduce the burden of suffering and disease through the education of physicians. I think education is quite critical for a lot of the things that we've been talking about today, and I'm happy to have shared some of our ideas with you. Thank you. Oh, hi, sorry.
Oh, you're good. Do we have time?
Oh, we do? Okay.
Do we have time? We do. I'll be quick, as usual. So, two questions, and this is about, I love this talk, and I loved your slides.
Thank you.
Number one slides,
That's
no question.
Doug Buehler at the Wilson Center.
They're beautiful, beautiful images, and really made me think. So in both of these examples you gave, I want to just challenge you a little bit, because research in education is always so challenging the way I think research in clinical care is challenging. So your productive failure case, I like your outcome in the single case, but I wonder about repeated cases, right? So medical students and other health professional students are really smart, and once they realize this is how it goes every day, they come in, they get this case they have no idea how to handle, then they get a lecture. Maybe the first time, they struggle. The second time, they check their phones, while they're waiting for the lecture, because they know they're not supposed to get the questions, they're supposed to struggle with them, and they don't feel like doing it. So I wonder about the repeated example. The second one is the integrated instruction, which again, beautiful outcome on the outcome in the short term, but again, I wonder about the long-term effect, whether there is any, basically. And I should say both these questions come from a certain amount of frustration with medical education is incredibly complex, incredibly demanding, a lot of discussion. Right now in clinical care in the US anyway, the nurse practitioners and the physician assistants actually are killing us. They're just as good as we are, and they get half as much instruction. At the PAs especially, I'd say, although I'm going to throw things up by the NPs. But my PAs are killing me. They're better doctors than I am. And they got half as much instruction as I got. So I wonder about these studies that look at very short-term outcomes, argue for additional types of education, maybe more complex and maybe more expensive education, actually, but then the long-term outcomes aren't there yet.
Mm-hmm. I think, the first thing is that you're absolutely right. It's very hard to show long-term outcomes, and that you are in education, broadly speaking, and that you have done something that has caused that long-term outcome down the road for many students, because they're going to have many experiences as they go. Your first question around essentially what it means to do curriculum science rather than education science. That's a bit of a different thing. And we know from a lot of the work that's been going on locally at U of T with the renewal of our own curriculum that if students aren't willing to engage and play your game, as one of our colleagues talks about it, they will find workarounds. They will try to be efficient, and they will try to avoid those failures and struggles if they can, in order to go do whatever they think is more important to do. So I think that you've targeted a really important point, or certainly around discovery learning and productive failure. I do think that we can think creatively around that. And there are many ways to do so, but I mean, I don't have time. We can talk, but yeah, you're absolutely right.
I actually had a much less cynical question than Peter. Are they going to be less cynical about the applicability and students, although it is true that nobody spends any time doing anything they don't actually have to do, in medical education at least. But in the United States at least, and I don't know whether the changes are happening in Canada as well, used to be 2 years of preclinical education and then 2 years of clinical education. And again, in the United States at least, there's a major trend, I don't know quite how much penetration it has, but it's definitely spreading, to push that preclinical education into a shorter and shorter time, 1.5 years, 1.25 years, very little time. And I'm wondering whether, based on this, taking this research at face value, it might not be going in the wrong direction, because I'm not sure how much students don't learn that much medicine in the second year of medical school. They get exposed to a lot of medicine. In fact, I suspect much of the value is letting them figure out what they want to do with their lives, which isn't unvaluable. But I wonder whether, in terms of training them as physicians, this might indicate that we're going in the wrong direction. What do you? I mean, do you think that that's what some of the research might be showing, or am I not?
Yeah, no, I think that, and Nikki talks about this more eloquently than me, but I'll do my best. But I think that really, traditionally, when you talk about the 2x2 model, it was really the idea that you were first trying to get those foundational basic science knowledge into people's head, and then they were going to go out in the world and understand the clinical aspect of it. And I think what we're really focused on is, however you design your curriculum, you're looking for integration at all points. So what you want is that integration of the clinical signs and symptoms with that basic science or mechanistic understanding right from the very beginning. And you want that to extend through as well as you can all the way through the clinical experiences that students will have. So if that means you have a 4-year program with integration that is happening practically out in the clinics and in the classroom at that level, sure. At the level of how you look at your materials, I think you can also do integration there around clinical science and basic science. But I think that if you focus on integration, I'm not sure the specific structure is as important as what you're achieving for your learners, however you choose to do so. If that makes
There were some implicit assumptions there about what actually goes on in the second 2 years and how much teaching and integration happens there.
And I think that that's something we all struggle with.
Experts are called upon to explain their decision-making at various points, and sometimes it comes in the form of an interruption, as yes. Professor Norman and some of your own research reflects. And I'm wondering how that builds into your notions of adaptive expertise, whether or not the ability to articulate where one's decision-making has gotten so far, what brought into the decision-making milieu, where that goes in. Is that a part of the educational process where one is told, perhaps in an interruption context or perhaps at the end of the decision-making context, how did you make that decision? And I'm just wondering, again, writing things out, creating narratives, and also addressing the fact that different audiences can be involved. You might need to explain what's going on to the patient, him or herself, or the person's caretaker, as well as somebody higher up in the food chain, and one's supervising physician.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, from an education perspective, what I do know is that typically if you have experts explain their reasoning, explain such as they can, because as Jeff pointed out, they don't always have access to their actual reasoning process. But when you have experts explain how they would approach a particular patient case for students, and even if you have multiple experts do so, the students tend to say, oh yeah, okay, that's obvious. Of course I knew that. I was going to do that too. But if you instead first ask the students to generate their own way that they would have approached a particular patient or case, and then you show them the experts' approaches, they tend to learn a lot more from that, because those experts then can make visible things that they might have missed. Thanks. Thank you.